All right, folks. This is April 9th, 2023 at 8:31 p.m. This is Federico Lines on States Rights Radio and
Seth Hancock of Seth Hancock Reports.
And we are with Restoring the Constitution tonight, and our episode is The Bill of Rights are under attack as always. We're going to focus on three Bill of Rights that are guaranteed rights by the Constitution against the federal government or any government or the state governments. The first, the third, and the fourth. So the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. Third Amendment is no soldier should be quartered without an order of Congress or a war. And the Fourth Amendment is no illegal search and seizures without a warrant from justice. So, Seth, I'll take it away with the First Amendment. Let's just chow down on what is the First Amendment so our viewers and listeners, can really get the grasp of what the First Amendment is and how important it is.
Yeah, the First Amendment, it usually gets boiled down to the Freedom of Speech Amendment, but I think we always need to remember that there are 5 rights guaranteed in that First Amendment, which is speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of press, freedom to assemble, and the right to petition your government for redress of grievances. And all 5 of those rights are vitally important to maintain a free society, and as the whole idea of this program, they're under attack all the time. So it's we have to keep our eyes on top of this and really see all the various ways that our rights are being eroded.
Now, you missed one key word that Trumpers, and particularly what happened in January 6th, you have the right to peacefully assemble.
Yeah.
So what the Trumpers did in January 6th, that was not a peaceful assembly. That was a little bit more hectic, but we'll get to that in another episode. But it's peacefully assembled. And, my understanding with the First Amendment is that it's a catch-22. It's, you have a right to say whatever you want, however you feel like it, without any government interference or arrest. And the other side is you can either listen to it or just ignore it. And the Supreme Court has made it very clear. In fact, they gave, I mentioned this last week's segment, the Supreme Court gave the rights to the Nazi movement in 1977 to parade in Illinois, in the city of Skokie, Illinois, which was the largest Holocaust survivors community. But they said that they have a right under the First Amendment. Now, they can parade. I don't agree with the Nazis. I don't agree with the Black Panthers or the Ku Klux Klan or whoever. I don't agree, we may disagree, Seth, but you have a right to say it. I have a right to say it. You can choose to ignore it. I can choose to ignore. That's the beauty of the First Amendment, correct?
Yeah, and that's, I know it's kind of a simple statement, and it gets used a lot, but the answer to speech you don't like is more speech, refuting that speech you don't like. So it's you have that right to speak. Use it.
Yes, that's right. I mean, use it in a peaceful assembly, so there's not any violence from your side or my side or anybody's side, and you won't have any issues like, happened in Charlottesville, and then, of course, all those Black Lives Matter protests and all that, people get so wild that you forget the main basics of the First Amendment. Nowhere else in the world has this basis of freedom and equality to speak your voice out without being issued a protective custody, like we've seen in various countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, South America and Central America. So, yeah, people, it's just outstanding that, Trumpers speak about First Amendment, and yet only to them. But, what happened in Tennessee, I think it's a little bit of disgraceful. And then plus, they expelled two members of their state house, but not the other one, and the other one is white, and these two are black. That's, what do you say about that, Seth?
Yeah, I don't know. I heard the Tennessee situation. I don't know the specifics there. I've seen it actually out in Wyoming. There was a Democrat who posted something that, it was pretty offensive, but it is also free speech, and there was a call to have her removed. It's something that you don't have to like what they say, and I find some of these things that these people have said, and I assume I probably would be appalled by what these Tennessee lawmakers said too, but they have a right to say it, and if we don't want them to attack us and our free speech, then you can't attack theirs. You need to respond to their speech with your own speech.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I may not agree with the majority of, I would say, both parties. Now I would say all parties, both Republican and Democrat, because they don't align with me whatsoever. But these two legislators from Tennessee, from the volunteer state, they have a right to say how they feel, and if they want, to speak out on the Second Amendment, which I know we spoke in the last segment, they have a right to say it. As long as they're not invoking violence, that's fine. You don't have to invoke violence to then, you can just say how you feel, and that's that. But I think, the Republican Party, which I think most of them used to be Democrats, now Republican, they're showing their true allegiance of the Dixiecrats, and that's what's killing the Republican Party. It's that they moved that switch from 64 and then moving onward, and now we're seeing that they're the tads showing the little bit of racism towards it, and that's not good. And then of course you see Trump, and that's even worse, right?
Yeah, and as we're talking, they get very upset with their speech being violated. But then, I didn't bring this up to you before we went on, but I wrote something maybe a month ago about in Florida, there was that blogger bill where they were trying to make bloggers report with the state if they mention any state official. And that was a Republican who introduced that. Now, Governor DeSantis came out and denounced that bill. But he has his own problem with free speech down there, where he's signed bills to basically make it a crime to have any criticism of the country of Israel, which they guise it under the idea that they're going after anti-Semitism. And first off, I'm not anti-Semitic myself, but you have a right to be anti-Semitic and espouse those ideas. But even more so, the problem with that bill is just criticizing the Israeli government was considered anti-Semitic, which is not anti-Semitic at all. You have a right to criticize governments, and Israel, for conservatives, it's a very socialist country, and there's a lot to be upset with the country of Israel. But the Republicans are very fine with attacking free speech when it comes to Israel.
Yeah, and we're laying down some actions by potential presidential candidate Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, where he says that we want to keep Florida free, and yet he is denying corporations having a First Amendment right, which was affirmed by the Supreme Court. That was pushed by a majority of Republicans when they decided Citizens United versus the FEC. So just because they don't like a law doesn't mean that you get to shut them out. If Disney doesn't like it, then they have a First Amendment and affirmed by the Supreme Court. Now that's the double standard of politics when it comes to a Supreme Court decision. And the bloggers bill that Ron DeSantis chose again. That's why I think that he may run for president, but he's not going to get it because Floridians are not well liked across the country. And he may have an approval rating here in Florida, but you go out to Illinois and Indiana, and the same thing happened, in history and all that. Floridians will never get the nomination from either party. It's just not going to happen because they're not well liked. But because they changed sides here astronomically, you saw here with the blogger bill, but yet he punishes Disney, and yet Disney came out. Is going to fight in that. And again, with Disney, you're biting the mouth that feeds you. Disney employs a lot to the state of Florida and contributes to the state of Florida. You cannot bite the hand that feeds you. So, that's a bad move on him. But on the First Amendment, where I want to also touch base, not only on the freedom of speech, but also on the freedom of religion, where people, I find it kind of insulting that we see in a dollar bill, "In God We Trust," and I see a national prayers breakfast, and I see always the chaplain saying a prayer. I don't believe that the founding fathers were Christian. They belonged to a Christian organization. But I do believe that, James Madison in particular, that had the idea of creating the First Amendment under that freedom of religion, it is a separation of church and state. There is no recognized religion here, and Congress, and it's in the words, it's in the first paraphrase sentence of the First Amendment, right? That Congress should make no law in the establishment of religion. So for Lauren Boebert to say that that's not true, she's, to put it lightly, she's a moron. But go on. What do you say?
Yeah. I think one of the big things is to remember that, the Puritans who came over to America first, they were coming to get away from an oppressive government that wasn't allowing them the right to their religion. But they didn't want to set up a state religion. And that's, the government's there to protect your rights to practice your religion the way you see fit. And I do see, I have thoughts on religion. A lot of people claim they aren't religious at all. I believe everybody's religious in a different way, but that's just a bigger philosophical discussion. But it really is. We don't want theocracy, and I'm a Christian, and I want my Christian beliefs to be allowed to be expressed, and I'm allowed to practice my religion, but I don't want to force it on others. And that the big problem is where we're at, and we've talked about this before, is that we're such a dependent society on government is doing everything that, if the government were strictly staying within its realm of authority, which is very minimal, very limited, we wouldn't have to worry a whole lot about these things. I brought it up, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, but on schools that, I don't want to force an atheist parent to pay for a government school that teaches young Earth creationism. On the same token, I don't want them to force me to pay for an education system that teaches Darwinian evolution. So what's the solution? Well, get the government out of schooling. Make people responsible. Make parents responsible for what they should be responsible for, the education of their children. And if we just cut out the government, a lot of these debates go away. We don't need to be at each other's throats about it.
Yeah, the sad thing is that the majority of people are not like you and I, Seth. They tend to be more emotionally decapitated, more emotionally, what's the word? More restrained, more emotionally not restrained, but just they're not well thinking. And you've had that issue back in 1925, where I mentioned in the last segment that they were denied the teaching of evolution, but they were teaching creationism. Well, I mean, how about you just teach both, and you let the parents decide, you let the children decide of what to believe. Do they want to believe in Adam and Eve, or that we came of a theory of apes and monkeys by Charles Darwin? So I mean, but you're right on your beginning point that we've become dependent on of federal government to dictate us what to do, and not only just the federal government, but that's the whole point of James Madison, where in the Commonwealth of Virginia they had a state religion, which was the Church of England. And James Madison was not a member of the Church of England. He was, I think, Episcopalian, if I'm not mistaken, but I need to check my source on that. But he was not a member of the Church of England. So that's the whole reason why he did the First Amendment, because the Commonwealth of Virginia had had a monopoly on that, like if they were part of the British Empire. And that, I also believe that we shouldn't have prayers in public schools or even in private schools. If private schools do not accept federal funds, they shouldn't have prayers in public schools, because that also, because when you pray, you're praying, you're praying to the majority of the people, the kids who are Christian or Protestant or Catholic, which it's God or Virgin Mary or whatever, and then you're denying to the Jewish children, the Muslim, Native Americans and such. So I think we should just that's the whole point of the First Amendment, is get rid of that "in God we trust" on the dollar bills, because that's a flagrant violation of the First Amendment, and the prayers and all that, and just leave it up to the parents and the individuals and all that. So I do agree that we've become too dependent.
Yeah, and that just goes to all so many of the problems we see, whether it be First Amendment violations or Second Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, whatever. We have so many problems because we've empowered the government to such an extent over our lives that it was never supposed to be. I mean, the whole idea of our government at its founding, the federal government, was that it would be so small we wouldn't even realize we had a government. I mean, we have to start taking ownership over our own lives, and that's a big hill to climb with how dependent we've become. But for me, I'm going to keep harping on it, even if it never gets close to coming to fruition in my lifetime, because that's the biggest problem I see, is we're so dependent.
Yeah, we are. And one last thing, one last touch before, because we touched on, you mentioned Third and Fourth Amendment. That's the next segment. But the first Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, and that gave power to the sovereign states and not to a strong central power. And yet, of course, we enter the Constitution of 1787, which the language, it may be implied that it's a strong central government, but I don't think so. I think the second Constitution was just like the first. It's just that it's open up to interpretation, but I see it as to correctly interpret as the first Constitution. Now, this is where I also touched base with the Confederacy, where they tried to label their government as part of the Articles of Confederation. But if they really, and they always proclaim as Jefferson Davis as the hero and Abraham Lincoln as the villain, as the federal government villain. And to be honest with you, Seth, Jefferson Davis was not a man of federalism. Jefferson Davis never was interested to give sovereign states their share of power. He wanted all power in the central government in Richmond, Virginia. So, it's always this mentality of certain individuals that, they speak of federalism, they speak of state sovereignty, they speak of individual freedom, and yet when they get the power, they're none of that. And I'm reading the biography of Judah Benjamin, who's the Secretary of War, and he is nothing to what the primary founding of America or even the Confederacy was. So I just want to touch on that because, even with the transition from the Articles, the first Constitution, to the new Constitution, the 1787 Constitution, there was this belief that sovereign states and 10th Amendment, but once you get to that power, they're not getting rid of it. They're not letting it go.
Yeah, and it's obviously, we're talking about the Constitution. The 10th Amendment is there to basically assure that the states would have rights to basically control their state the way they want to. And it's as we talk about dependency, not only are the people dependent on the government, but the states have become dependent on the federal government. There's so much money in Washington, D.C. that's being divvied out, and when the Democrats are in power, they divvy it out to the Democrat states more. When the Republicans are in power, they divvy it out to the Republican states more. This creates further divide. It creates this tribal mentality that we've devolved into, and it's you got to get. If you have problems in your state and you have problems that are stemming from government control, it would make sense that you'd want to deal with that locally, because you actually have a better chance of having a relationship with your local elected officials than you do with the federal government. So you want all the power in government, and I'm somebody who wants very little power for government, whether it's federal, state, or local. But you want the local government to be more powerful than the federal government. I mean, because you actually can deal with them. So when they make a mistake, you can actually go to somebody and redress your grievances and possibly actually get heard.
Yeah, you're right, and you're gonna have it a much easier level at the state and local than the federal level, where now all the power is being concised to just one location. When this country is even with 13 colonies, 13 states, it was still a pretty big country. You cannot have power in New York City or Philadelphia or even Washington City. This country was way too big. Even, for England, it was way too big. And so to make this belief that all power comes from D.C. and you're a farmer and you're trying to apply for a license and the only one is the agriculture department, but it's really booked and it's only from 8 to 5, and it's a real pain in the butt. And even online, I tried to apply for a trademark, for federal trademark, and it was just too hectic. Why not just give it to, we need to find a way to reduce that federal government, and not by force, but just by nullifying and refusing to cooperate. But that's another topic for discussion. But yeah, no, you're right. We've really become too dependent on our Bill of Rights to the federal government. And with that, we will turn to the Third and the Fourth Amendment. And I'll take it away because you mentioned that you wrote an article, or you read an article on the Third Amendment. And just to clarify to our listeners, Seth, what is the Third Amendment again?
The Third Amendment is basically no quartering of troops in your home. You have a right to not be forced to house troops.
Okay, and it's something that you read or something that you wrote that you tied on with the Third Amendment that's very interesting with the NSA?
Yeah, it was something I read. It was actually in the New American by a guy named Joe Wolverton. I've never read his stuff before, but made a very interesting case about how the Third Amendment is being violated. And it's interesting because, I think the government has violated all of the Bill of Rights, but we don't think about the Third Amendment enough because, obviously we don't physically have troops being quartered in people's homes today. But this guy for the New American wrote an interesting, thought-provoking piece to me, making the case that the Third Amendment is being violated because the spy state through the National Security Agency. And I'll just kind of read his brief little thing at the end on his piece. He wrote, "There could be no more compelling evidence of the military nature of the principal agents of the surveillance state, and thus any unwanted intrusion of the NSA into the homes of Americans would seem to violate, if not the letter, most assuredly the spirit of the Third Amendment. Remember, the purpose behind the Third Amendment was not just to prevent the seizure of private homes by the military, but to deny the military access to the conversations and attitudes of the homeowners, access that was and still is used to identify people as enemies of the tyrant and to keep those suspected of harboring anti-government sentiments under the close watch of agents of the regime. In the case of the NSA, those agents are part of the military, and thus the Third Amendment could be invoked to stop the infiltration of the surveillance states into the homes of Americans." And that's essentially what we have. We have this agency that basically they live in our cell phones, they live in our computers, they're tracking our data, it does seem to be an interesting case of how the government is violating the Third Amendment.
No, you're right, and I know that some liberal progressives and Republicans have, and liberal conservatives, liberal Republicans, liberal and progressive Democrats, they've always made the case that the Constitution is an old document. It's it needs to be updated, but no, it doesn't need to be updated. The times need to update with. And the document needs to stay the same. And you're right. We don't hear about the Third Amendment as much because there is no martial law declared. Soldiers are not quartering into people's homes and businesses, but they are doing it digitally now, and that is an invasion of privacy, and that is an invasion where, again, if that happens, they cannot do it without a warrant because that will be an illegal search and seizures. Now, sadly, the Supreme Court, and many times, has favored law enforcement and not favored the Fourth Amendment. Scalia is one of the few justices at present times that was always in defense of the Fourth Amendment. Thomas, regrettably, has always sided with police, which always is a huge disappointment. But this is something that even Trumpers don't understand, or Republicans and Democrats don't understand. You cannot give power too much to law enforcement because then that will defeat the purpose of the whole reason why we fought the Revolutionary War, why we are always upstanding against tyranny. And when I see police, pull over an individual, whether he's white or black or Hispanic or whatever, or Asian, or Native American, you have to respect its rights. Even if that person may have committed an infraction, you cannot take it upon yourself to question him without a lawyer present, or question him without, without going through without a warrant. So if this probable cause that they've invented, Seth, is just a gateway to drive through the Fourth Amendment, drive through our liberties. And that's where I get with Terry versus Ohio, but I want to get your input on that, and discussion on that, on the probable cause crapola that they put on us.
Yeah, it's kind of really perverted the notion of what law enforcement is supposed to be. We really want peace officers, not law enforcement officers. Now, police should enforce the law when it's needed. But we really made this kind of, we've put police in a position where they think it's their job to keep us safe. Well, I think it's your job to keep yourself safe. That's why we have a Second Amendment. But the job of police are to keep the peace, especially when you're out in public and effectively to do police work when a crime has actually been committed. It's things like stop and frisk in New York. How anybody could support that and call themselves conservative and for limited government is beyond me. You can't just stop people on the streets and suspect them of possibly having committed a crime and harass them. I mean, that's what it is. And we've got to respect people's rights and liberties. If a crime's been committed, okay, then the police have more leeway to, if somebody fits the description of the perpetrator, they have a little more leeway. But we're not talking about a crime's been committed. We're talking about suspecting that they might have committed a crime. Well, you don't have authority to just harass people. And it's just something that we need to get back to understanding how who's responsible for your safety. You are. It's not the job of the police to keep you safe. And the Supreme Court has actually ruled that on multiple occasions that police don't have any obligation to put themselves in harm's way to protect citizens. So we have to understand that.
No, now, what cases is that where the Supreme Court said that police are not here to protect you? What cases are that?
I don't have the exact name of it, but I remember there was a case, one that I can recall off the top of my head was a case in New York from the early 2000s, I think it was. And there was a case where this guy was brutally beaten in front of police officers on a subway, and the guy subdued this suspect who was a suspected serial killer, and the police just stood by and watched as this guy nearly killed this innocent bystander in New York, and the bystander eventually subdued the guy, and then after the bystander subdues the guy, the police come out and take credit for apprehending the suspect, which is like insult to injury. The cops didn't do anything. And the Supreme Court eventually ruled that they didn't have an obligation to go in and protect them.
Yeah, sadly, this is one of the things that, the federal court has always been sending us mixed messages and always trying to play politics, and it's always been like that. When I know they've always been out there to play politics, whether it's for civil rights or all that. So it doesn't surprise me. But one case that really sat with me, not the George Floyd case, but the one where was it down in Georgia? The individual that he was going through a drive-thru in Wendy's, and he kind of passed out, and he was just there, and either he was on drugs or whatever, or he was taking bad medicine, and the police, people have to understand that when you dial 911, the first thing they're going to ask you is, what's your emergency? It's either police, health emergency, or fire. But that's also where people have made in mind that 911 is only police. And, not everything has to involve the police. It could involve a medical emergency. It could involve a fire emergency. So that's another thing is where, we've now been in the society where people say 911, oh yeah, police, call police. No, I mean, sometimes police should be called for stuff like that. And for that poor individual that, he passed out, he needed medical attention. He needed somebody to call 911 for medical attention. And now he ended up dead because, whatever he had on his car, that's again protected in the Fourth Amendment. If they suspect that he has drugs in the car, then they need to hold the car, get him some medical attention, and get a warrant to search the car. So that's also where we've come in society where, everybody now says, oh, this person is committing a crime or this person doesn't feel well, call 911, call the police will handle it. And that's not what, it's a society where now we've involved law enforcement into like a protective custody. And that's not the main purpose of the Third or the Fourth Amendment. And then we'll get on the Fifth and the Sixth Amendments, and then the Sixth and the Seventh, where you have a right to trial and you have a right to due process. But that's for later. But right now we need to focus on people to understand the main concept of the Fourth. And you cannot search somebody's vehicle or somebody's property or somebody's phone records or somebody's bank records without due process of a warrant. And people need to understand that you could be white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever, from whatever race, from whatever ethnicity. You have to be respected. And this is something that it really bothers me with Republicans, that they only, right now they're crying me a river with the January 6th, but then they're not crying for people like George Floyd or Freddie Gray or the guy from New York with the cigarettes. So it's everybody. It affects everybody, and everybody has these rights.
Yeah, and and it's such a tough. It's tough to have conversations with people on this these days because it's boiled down to such simplistic arguments. It's either defend the police or defund the police, and that there's a lot of complex discussions we could have if we get out of our tribes. I just, I think about it, and I conservatives need to remember, who was going to be called to remove you from a public building for not wearing a mask? It would be the police. Do you think the police have authority to remove you for not wearing a mask? We can discuss that, but the police have become far too often enforcers of edicts. They're there to enforce the feelings when really they're there to enforce the law, and the law has to go through a process. And we have too many laws, but it's. We just need to kind of know our rights. I think that's a big thing, is people need to know their rights. And, if you get pulled over by the police, before you give up your driver's license, I encourage you to have the officer tell you exactly why you're being pulled over before you give them your driver's license. Because if it's an illegal stop, they don't have a right to ID you. But people just kind of, they give deference to the police. And, if they got pulled over, it must have been for a legitimate reason. Well, it's not always.
No.
And people need to know their rights. And, you don't have to be rude to a cop. I mean, if a cop pulls you over and you don't think you did anything wrong, be polite about it, but stand up for your rights.
Oh, no, you're right there, and that's a good point. You don't have to be rude to anybody, and just, politely say, why am I pulled over, before I give you my information. But yet again, you don't, with today's technologies, I don't think that you even have to give I mean, they'll ask for your license, but I think before the officer approaches you, he's already got a computer with your license plate and checked out and who you are. So, I mean, it's that has become, also, do they have the authority to search you before he's begun questioning you? And, would that also be a violation? If they pull somebody else like Joe McIntyre and he has priors, do they have just because he has priors doesn't mean that he's actually committed a crime? And that's where many Republicans in Congress, many Democrats that don't want to defund the police and have this spectacle, they rather just like the Giuliani method, stop and frisk and ask. We ask the questions later, as there's a German joke. We ask the questions, and nobody has a right to question anything, and that's basically not what what our rights are. And you're right. Know your rights. Know your rights before an authority figure questions you, and you do have rights. And on the Fourth Amendment, just because it says papers and documents, it's quite valid with bank records. It's a quite valid article that is a quite valid right that just because it was wrote in 1789, it doesn't mean that it's not valid 2023. It's absolutely valid.
Yeah, and those are these are foundational rights, and so they don't go away. It's the argument of it's an old document. Well, that doesn't matter. I don't know how do you get rid of foundational principles? It's just these are rights that are inherent in us by our humanity, and nobody has a right to violate them.
No, I mean, you're right. I mean, it is an old document, but the founding principles are still there. The way to do it is create an amendment process and amend those rights, but it's going to be very difficult when you do that. But yet again, the people wanted to, bring back an old vice of liquor, but yet they don't want to know your rights on your personal property rights and lawful rights and all that. So they rather bring back an old liquor vice and not know about your other rights. And that's where also this country's kind of messed up, that they're looking for it has also become a very superficial state of mind in America.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I give credit, I would have been against prohibition back then, but at least they went through the constitutional process to get rid of it. And now they just violate our rights at will, and they don't even act as if the Constitution exists anymore.
Exactly. I mean, they got rid of the 18th Amendment through the 21st Amendment, even though that I'm against the 18th Amendment to begin with, and that shouldn't have ever been through the books. But you had some ideological demagogues, and they just ruined it. But yet they established the 18th Amendment, which was and yet they can't get rid of an amendment that takes away our money and give it to the government. But that's a discussion for another. That's the 16th Amendment. But it just boggles the mind that it's okay to bring back an old vice of liquor, but the government still has a right to take our money, and nobody really has challenged that. And that we can talk about on another segment, Seth. But let's close it out here. But any last moments on the Third and the Fourth Amendment and the First?
All I'll say, actually I can kind of wrap up it with, as we were talking about knowing your rights, I'd encourage people to look at some of these YouTubers who do First Amendment audits. Some of them are a little annoying, but some are pretty good. But I just watched a video of a man in Florida. He does honor your oath civil rights investigations, and he was just pulled over this week he was flashing his headlights to oncoming traffic to warn them of a speed trap coming up, and he got pulled over for it. And he refused to give his ID because the courts have ruled that is your First Amendment right to warn drivers when a speed trap is coming up. So that ties into both the First and the Fourth Amendment, and the cop eventually let him go because they knew they didn't have a right to ID him because he was within his rights. So that's the importance of knowing your rights. Mm-hmm. Just, if you get pulled over for something like that you know that you had a right to do, you don't have to comply.
No, you're right. That's the word. You don't have a right to comply. You can cooperate to an extent, but you cannot be into submission. And police officers have to know that you law enforcement officials are not the magistrate. That's where we've seen the federal government take that role as if they were the magistrates. The FBI, the ATF, what happened in Ruby Ridge in '91, what happened in Waco '93, and the Montana Freeman in '94. Where law enforcement has taken that role of magisterial authority, and they really don't. And people have to understand that you are just the law officers trying to maintain the peace. And if this person may have committed a crime or is about to commit a crime, then you need to have evidence to present to somebody that says, hey, listen, we need to go after this person. And if he's in the street, and you cannot just hold him just like that, you need some type of evidence of that, and I'm bringing up George Floyd or Eric Garner. You cannot just chokehold him or put your knee down to his throat, because that's not your role. You're not the executioner. You're just trying to see what's going on and how to maintain the peace, as you said. So know your rights, know your Fourth Amendment rights for everybody. I've always said the Fourth Amendment is for everybody. It's not just for white people. It's not just for black people. It's not just for Hispanic people. It's for all citizens and all residents of this land. So, let's cut the BS here where, you only want to show support for the January 6th, who are mostly white, but not to some African American who got his who got his throat crushed by a knee. It's for everybody. It's an amendment for everybody.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I think we had a good discussion, Seth. And with that, I will close out. Seth, always a pleasure having us together in discussion to restore the Constitution and our rights. And until Sunday, I will see you then.
Yep.